Every Destiny player knows the elements. They're the things on your energy and heavy weapons that make the bright colored shields go pop. They're the things that make your subclasses. And we know there are 3 light elements, solar, arc, and void, and 1 darkness, stasis, so far. Now wait. I already see you clicking away. Don't. I promise this is going somewhere. Now, you already probably have some sort of idea what these elements are. Arc zaps people. Solar is flamey hot, and void just, well, it kind of purples people to death. But what are these elements really? What is the physical meaning behind them, and can we tie them back to our reality? Well, since you're watching this video, the answer is probably definitely yes, unless I clickbaited you. Indeed, each of the light elements can be explained as our guardian having control of and manipulating 3 of the 4 fundamental forces of the universe. That is, the strong force, electromagnetism, and gravity. Throughout this video, I'm going to be quoting a post from the Reddit user John Demonsbane. See, I have a background in physics, but I'm also extremely lazy, and he already had this detailed write-up. So I'm just going to blatantly rip it off. With his permission, of course. His explanations are great, and I agree with basically everything he says in terms of the light elements. However, stasis is a different beast entirely, so I'm going to be covering that in the next video in this series, along with the other possible darkness subclasses. And I promise this time it's actually coming, not like, the last video. So, as I said, the light elements can be explained as 3 of the 4 fundamental forces. And that's nice, but what are those forces? Electromagnetism is the combination of all electric and magnetic forces, which are 2 sides of the same coin. For a long time, scientists thought that they were actually 2 completely separate forces, but then a man named Ørsted came along and showed that electric currents in a wire can cause magnetic effects on a compass. Basically, the force is caused by the interaction between charged particles. So for example, 2 electrons will repel each other, while an electron and a positive ion will attract. Then, if you take one of those particles and move it, accelerating it, that will cause a magnetic force. Now, I'm not going to get any deeper on the magnetic force part because it's quite a bit more complex. For example, your fridge magnet requires the knowledge of spin and domains and multiple other things that we don't have time for. And it's not really important. What is important, though, is that the electromagnetic force is the thing that bonds atoms to become molecules. Fun fact, if you touch an object, you are never actually touching your hand molecules to the object molecules. Instead, what actually happens is that the electrons on the outside of your hand repel the electrons on the outside of the object. And as you get closer and closer, that repulsion gets stronger and stronger until the force you're applying can no longer overcome that. And that's what we experience as touch. Even if you were really strong, you'd never actually be able to force the 2 molecules together because of a thing called the Pauli exclusion principle. This just says that 2 electrons, or fermions, can never occupy the same place and same state. Well, if you weren't actually a person and you were a giant sun, you might be able to, but I digress. The electromagnetic force is exchanged via photons. These are a type of boson and the messenger particles of the force. You may recognize photons as the things coming out of your screen right now, letting you see. Photons are light. What do I mean by exchange, though? Well, that's beyond the scope of this video. The strong nuclear force, or just strong force, is the thing that binds protons and neutrons together. If you remember your high school chemistry class, these 2 types of particles are what create the nucleus of an atom. Without the strong force, we wouldn't exist, the Earth wouldn't exist, and neither would the sun or the stars. Actually, you can say basically the same thing about all 4 fundamental forces, hence the name. But without the strong force, everything would be like a soup of protons and neutrons, passing by each other, tipping their hats, but never getting too close because they're kind of racist. The strong force is also what causes nuclear fusion, which you might have heard about. This is when two atoms are fused together, which requires a huge amount of heat and pressure and time to overcome that Pauli exclusion principle and quantum tunnel through the potential barrier. Also, this strong force is exchanged via gluons. And you can remember this by strong force binds like glue, hence gluons. Finally, the last of these three forces is gravity. This is kind of the oddball out of the four fundamental forces. It's like the ugly duckling. And gravity is the reason why you fell on your face when your mother dropped you as a baby. Shit, I can already hear the angry comments. David, that's so mean. I never had a mother. So we all know what gravity is, right? Or do we? There was this guy named Einstein who came along in the early 20th century with a theory of relativity. You might have heard about it. And one interesting thing it said is that gravity can actually be modeled as a warp in the fabric of space-time. What does that mean? Well, let's make an analogy. Imagine a trampoline, and now take a bowling ball and chuck it on there. What's going to happen? Well, that once flat trampoline is going to curve inwards, and it's going to become something akin to, remember those coin drains that whenever you went to a museum as a child, you could put one on the edge and watch it circle around the drain? Basically that. Now, if you did the same thing here, you'd see that coin going around and round that dip or that well created by the bowling ball. Here, the trampoline is space-time, and the bowling ball is a mass, say like a planet. This is a really oversimplified explanation. That's only 3 dimensions and space-time is 4, but it'll work for our purposes. So remember that and keep it in your mind because we're going to come back to it later. Okay? Good. So how exactly do all 3 of these fundamental forces relate back to destiny? Well, for this part, I'm going to crib from our good friend John. You can tell I'm quoting from him because I'll be holding my laptop here. So let's start with arc. You might have already guessed this one, and it's based on the electromagnetic force. John says, by directly tapping into and manipulating the electromagnetic force, Guardians generate electrical current and discharge it in destructive fashion. Lightning grenades shoot lightning. Stormcaller, same thing. Then you have flux or skip grenades, which use electrostatic charge to stick to or be attracted to enemies. As far as enemies' weapons are concerned, the Fallen are classically associated with arc. This makes sense as they scavenge much of their equipment from other races, and the easiest way to weaponize a wide variety of technological components from different sources is by using electrical current. This would also explain why we see so many arc weapons across other races though. Again, gameplay mechanics are also part of it. One weapon worth mentioning specifically is the Risk Runner, as it manipulates arc in a more complicated way than just giving charge to ammunition. It also absorbs arc energy. This allows it to use incoming electrical current to supercharge itself, and any current it absorbs is that much less to pass through and damage the user. But some still does, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. One other weapon of note is the Cold Heart. This is an arc weapon and should not be stasis. The reason for this is that it shoots a super hot arc laser, and then has to super cool that to prevent your Guardian from getting an owie. Next, we have Solar, the strong nuclear force. This name creates an obvious relationship to the power of the sun, powered by stellar fusion, as noted hunter Tevis Larson mentions in this quote about the Golden Gun. Why is it golden? Well, let's see. What's the fundamental force we're dealing with here? Solar energy, right? Like from the sun? I swear, you kids come out of the tower greener and greener every year. Why is it gold? Oh, Tevis, you silly goose. Recall what I said about fusion. Even though it requires a ton of heat and pressure, read energy, to create fusion, it also releases a ton of energy, like in an explosion. Actually, the problem with fusion right now in the real world is that scientists are not able to reliably create more energy than it's required to actually fuse the particles. And that's the reason why we're not using it to power this video or your homes. but maybe one day. John goes on to say, by tapping into this force, Guardians create the same radiant energy that powers a star. Golden Guns fires what are likely bolts of superheated plasma, with hammers being large chunks of the same material. Solar grenades are like tiny short-lived suns, and fusion grenades appear to be like chunks of the core of a fusion reactor or of a hydrogen bomb. They explode with greater force when attached to something. I assume because that adds some of the mass of the target to multiply the power of the reaction. For enemies and weapons, Cabal use solar more than the other races. The Leviathan has twin suns at the top of the spire of stars. And that's not the main reactor, near as I can tell, but does suggest that fusion reactions are one of the primary power sources their technology uses. Any plasma or thermite-based weapon would probably have a similar energy signature as well. Finally, we get to Void. This one is a bit more complex, and is why I spent so much time creating the trampoline and coin drain analogy for the space-time warping that a mass creates. Remember that? Okay. As our friend John points out, there's a bit of lore that talks about the physical meaning of the void. The universe is defined by fundamental forces. Beneath the world of light and matter lies the vacuum, and the vast, dark secrets that it contains. In the understanding of this vacuum lies the secret of void light. Seth Dixon, the grimoire author, said that he based void on the idea of the quantum vacuum. What is that? That doesn't sound like gravity. I actually take issue with Seth's description. Seth's. I actually take issue with that description, but to explain why, we'll have to get into the weeds of the physics a bit. So strap your butts in, because we're about to learn you some quantum field theory. Just a note, everything I'm about to say will be a gross oversimplification of the theory, because, well, this is a 15-minute YouTube video for entertainment, and not a doctoral dissertation. If you want to learn more, please go see a serious YouTuber. In the field of quantum mechanics, there is a theory called the quantum field theory, or QFT. Just as there are 4 fundamental forces that underpin all of existence, each one of those forces has its own associated field. To give an example, you've heard of the magnetic field or the gravitational field of Earth. These are the same type of fields as in quantum field theory, except there's a different one for each of the fundamental forces. So to imagine this, let's picture a grid of balls, with each one connected by a spring to its nearest neighbor. So imagine if you flicked one of the balls, it would start to vibrate, and so would its nearest neighbors. And as you go further along, the vibrations would get less and less. This is the idea of a field, and each one of the springs and balls together are called a quantum harmonic oscillator, or QHO. Are you with me so far? So each one of these balls is like a particle that exchanges force, like a gluon or a photon. Each one of the springs is like the potential between the two, and the amount that the ball moves is the energy within the system. Now, one thing that quantum field theory says is that you can't just give these balls an arbitrary amount of energy. You have to give it in discrete bits. Think of them as packets of energy, with each packet being equal to each other. You can give 1 packet, or 2 packet, or 1,000,000 packets. But you can never give the ball 2/3 of a packet, or 1/10 of a packet. It has to be whole numbers. This requirement is called quantization, and it's actually one thing that underpins most of quantum mechanics, which is where the name comes from. If you're following along at home, you might have the question, can the ball have 0 packets of energy? And that's a great question. Your mom and I are very proud of you. But the answer is no, it cannot. There is a minimum amount of energy that a quantum harmonic oscillator must have, and that energy is equal to 1/2 h bar times the frequency, where h bar is the Planck's constant, and don't let that intimidate you, it's just a number. Since the frequency can never be 0, then energy can never be 0. But you might ask, why can't the frequency be 0? And to that I say, anyways, this minimum energy of the QHO is called the vacuum energy, or 0-point energy. It's the thing that Seth Dixon was talking about in terms of void. So according to Mr. Dixon, this vacuum energy concept is what the void subclass was based on. But how do they correlate? Well, I think I have the answer to that, and it has to do with something called the Casimir effect. This is a phenomena that happens when you have two plates of metal placed in a vacuum and very, very close to one another. If you let them move freely, eventually they attract each other, and this is because there are some resonances in this vacuum energy. So with that, you might already have this idea forming in your head. There's this vacuum with energy in it that can attract things, maybe like a vortex grenade or a nova bomb. The problem is, vacuum energy, by its very nature of being the minimum amount, is very small. Granted, we are guardians who are paracausal beings that have access to godlike powers, so theoretically we could have access to all the vacuum energy of the universe, which might explain things. The problem is, none of this really maps well to the actual abilities that we see in-game, which is why personally I like John's explanation much better of relating it to gravity. He says, so how do void powers work? It's not exactly gravity. Nova bombs don't suck people in like a black hole, though they do certainly have an attraction for doorways and little outcroppings. The grimoire description states it holds the power of a collapsing star. That could be a black hole, but the name tells you it's a different type of stellar collapse, a supernova. A typical star doesn't collapse on itself because the strong force and gravity are in balance. But when gravity wins, that star collapses and explodes. This is where the power of many void abilities comes from. Actually, just a slight clarification, stars are balanced by the inward attraction of gravity and the outward thermal pressure created by thermonuclear explosions. Granted, these explosions are caused by nuclear fusion, which happens because of the strong force, and I believe that's what John actually meant here, but I just wanted to be petty. Also, there's a bit in the lore book, The Dreaming City, which states, "Behold, and he drew forth from the quantum vacuum a shrieking singularity, which he held between his hands, and then telescoped down into nothing." That was a warlock creating either a nova bomb or a vortex grenade. Either way, singularities are these infinite masses that have been collapsed down to a single point because of, drumroll, gravity. I rest my case. But actually not. John goes on to say, but there's more to it than gravitational potential energy. Let's take a look at the Voidwalker Grimoire card. Gifted with the Traveler's Light, you will tear reality asunder. Certain void abilities also affect the fabric of reality, in some fashion. Blink, now that only Voidwalkers have it, is explained by warping space-time. Hunter Dodge, a lesser version of that, but it also bends light so that you're invisible. Ward of Dawn is also a manipulation of space. You create a hard shell walling off a small pocket of space in which Armor of Light makes you very resistant to damage. So which is it? Vacuum energy or gravity? Personally, I think all the abilities map better onto the latter. However, I can see how the initial concept might have been based on the former. Also, Destiny is Destiny. It's pretty soft sci-fi, and so the default answer to anything mysterious or unexplained is space magic. So it could just be that Bungie sprinkled in a little of column A, a little of column B, and then walked away, giving us both the finger and jazz hands. Because why not? So those are the light elements. They're 3 of the 4 fundamental forces. The 4th force is called the weak nuclear force, and this is the thing that makes materials like plutonium and uranium decay and become radioactive. This seems like it would map well to a darkness element, though not stasis. That's its own beast, which I have a different theory for. That'll come in the next video. So now you can tell your friends that the solar element is actually just the strong nuclear force, which binds all the nuclei of the universe together. And that void is actually just a warping of space-time. And when they say, "Sir, this is a Rite Aid," you can tell them all the intricacies of the quantum field theory as you wait for the cops to arrive. Until next time, Guardians, I've been Meromorphic, and you've been great. Meromorphic out!